This material in the last couple of decades has been used everywhere, and anyone in building knows you're using it in the floors, you're using it in the walls and in the roofs. Now I've got to do the roof of this summer house. It's a big area and I don't particularly like this job. There's some new products on the market, ways of cutting and ways of fitting, which is going to make your life easier, but most of all, it will improve the performance of the insulation board. So Part L of the building regulations stipulates everything you need to know about insulation. You're doing a job and on the drawing it'll tell you what to use and where to use it. Fine, that's what it's called as designed. But generally, when it's built or as built, the performance of the insulation is sometimes not what it should be. And why is that? It's something called a performance gap. Now, a performance gap is nothing technical. All it means is how well it fits to itself, to a timber, in a cavity, under a floor. There are gaps. Now, no matter how skillful you are, when you're cutting this material, it's generally quite thick and you're fitting it in between rafters. The rafters are undulating because timber just does that, or it's down to the skill of the carpenter who built the roof. You are going to end up with gaps. You're going to get the cold air meeting the warm air and you're going to get leakage of heat. This can cause condensation and all other kinds of problems in the fabric of the building. The product that I'm using to make this job work is called Gapotape. It's a memory foam which goes around the edge of the solid insulation, gives you a perfect friction fit, and it takes up all of the undulation and it stays fixed tight forevermore. I have a new machine which will enable me to cut these with dust extraction, and it just makes the job a lot more comfortable to do. Not only that, I'm not covering the whole site in this dust, and if anyone's worked on a site where they've just put this in, the place is covered in this dust. So when I constructed this roof, I put all of my timbers at 600 centres as directed by the structural engineer, and that was also my choice. The reason I like 600 centres is there's less timber, less potential bridging, and also the insulation is in larger panels and it takes less time to fit because you're fitting less panels. I will measure the average and I will take off between 8 and 10 millimeters. That is all you need to take off to tape both sides of the board and give you that perfect friction fit, which you'll see shortly. So normally when you're doing solid insulation, you will have to measure every single bit and try to cut it as accurately as possible. And quite often, from experience, we cut it through the narrow section of the board, and that enables us to put shorter pieces in and keep them tighter. When you're cutting it down the length, it's a lot more tricky to fit them in. With the tape, we can cut the board through the length and we can fit larger panels because the tape is taking out all the discrepancy. Here's a piece that I've made as a sample or a test piece, and I've checked it in a few spaces and it works perfectly. So I'm happy with the dimensions of how it's going to fit. That enables me to cut for this roof every panel the same size. I do one measure, one setup and one set of cuts. And that is going to simplify things and save time. There's a lot of hidden cost in putting this kind of insulation in. What I mean by hidden cost is it's the time you take trying to cut it in, to shoot it in, cover yourselves in dust. Some people then go round and foam it in, try to foam it in, and all that does is just put the foam in the front edge. It's very difficult to foam up the full thickness of the board, and that's where the performance gap problems come from. So again, for speed, I've made a rod. This enables me to cut my panels all exactly the same size to suit. So there's two main types of rigid insulation board. There's your standard PIR and there's a phenolic type. So what is the difference? Now the phenolic is better for thermal performance. So for the same thickness of material, you get a better performance for the phenolic. And I've actually used it here. So where I'm standing right at this moment, I'm standing on the line of a wall, which is going to be traveling up and intersecting with the roof. So on the side that the plant room is, which is unheated, although the plant will generate heat, I've used the phenolic board because this needs to make sure the plant room, because it's unheated, will stay warmer. So in the walls and in the roof above, I've got the phenolic, and it will give me a much better performance. But don't get this muddled up. When you're ordering solid or rigid insulation boards, make sure that you get what you need. Now, if you're limited on space, you may need to use a phenolic because you can use less insulation in a tighter area. Okay, so bear that in mind. If you think you can't get a full fill and maintain your ventilation, then phenolic is the way to go. So it's a very nice product. It cuts beautifully. It actually cuts better with the insulation saw than the PIR. It's just a much nicer material. So that's the phenolic. You can see the color difference. It's more of a pink board, and this is just like a creamy color, the typical PIR material. So I have got over 100 panels to cut to enable me to finish this whole job. And as I mentioned, most of the panels are within a few millimeters of each other because I spaced all of my rafters out very accurately when I built my roof, and that's just something that I do. So when this material is delivered, so when I got all the EcoTherm delivered, it comes on some really nice big pallets. So the pallets are the length of the board, so 2.4 by 1.2. I had some 7x2 left over, which is just like roof rafter material. And so what I've constructed is a very simple, cost-effective table to do my rips. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be using the new Festool insulation saw, and it's a little bit of a game changer, partly because it's sucking away most of the dust, which is a major benefit to me. Secondly, it runs on the rails, which makes sure the cuts are nice and straight. And also it cuts at almost 90 degrees. So there's none of this undulation that you get when you follow a handsaw. You may be able to hear the rain in the background, so I'm so glad I'm inside here. It's one of those rainy day projects, I reckon. This is a modification that I've made. I've attached a box section of aluminium by screwing through the underneath, and all that's doing is making it really rigid and straight, okay? And then I've got two boards on the end which are slotted to take that, and this length is exactly the panel width I've got. Now, I've got a self-adhesive tape measure actually bonded onto here, which is relative to the center of the blade when this is clipped on the rail. So this is how the saw attaches. It drops in and sits on the rail there. Now, for using these saws with the rails, you hook it on the rail with the base that comes with it, and it cuts exactly 50 millimeters away. So I've allowed for that, obviously. So where the end of my tape is 0 is obviously the center of the saw blade. They are almost perfect 90 degrees, which is what I'm looking for. Now, there are instances, especially when you're doing a roof, that you need to incorporate a few angles. And the beauty of this tape is it comes in different widths. So for this instance, this is a 100mm rigid insulation board. So I use 100mm tape there. Where I'm coming up against a ridge board, for example, if we take this section of timber and mimic a ridge board, I need to meet my ridge, just like this. And this is imperative. This is all about that performance gap. We don't want to finish with a square board against the ridge, because what you end up with is a large cold spot there, which is where warm air is going to escape, meet cold air, And that's where you're going to get these condensation problems that could give you some issues and damage the fabric of the building. So where I've got the wider cut, I'm using a slightly wider tape. In this case, it's a 120mm. The roof pitch that I'm working with is 19 degrees, so it's quite low. If it was a steeper roof, then I would use a slightly wider tape. So the one drawback of this saw is it won't allow you to cut those angles, but again, in true Robin Clevett style, I have made an adaptation. All it is, some fillets, that gives me the exact angle. And then I've put some rubber tape on the bottom as well to stop it from shifting around. I've got some grounds here to support it. If you didn't have that grounds there, it's going to rock over. So where you're coming into a hip or a valley, you're going to end up with a compound cut. So it's compound by the fact that it needs to be triangular to fit into the hip or into the valley. And I've made a template of the angle and I've checked it everywhere and it's exactly right for the hip or the valley because I'm using an equal pitch, so it's 19 degrees all around. The only time that would change is if you'd have a slope at 1 degree of pitch meeting a hip at another degree of pitch. Then you'd need to set 2 lots of angles up. To get the compound angle, I've measured the angle and I've made, because it's different to the ridge angle, it's a little bit less, it's actually 15 degrees in my case. I've made a slightly longer rail up, which consists of an angle fillet there, an angle fillet there, attached by this piece of MDF, which gives me my 50mm margin to the side of the blade and runs the blade against. And that is going to produce me a compound mitre to go in against my hip or the valley. So if this was the triangle, if it was going against the hip, it would fit in like this, and if it was going against the valley, it would fit in the other way. So again, that's going to save me a lot of time. I've measured it once, I've marked the angle once, I've made this once, and now I can do it. And just like I was cutting a pair of rafters, if I take a full length of board and I cut this angle through the middle, I will immediately get 2 pieces. If you pass me that piece over there, I'll get 2 pieces. I'll get a left and I'll get a right. Again, that speeds things up. So I think these 2 are, you see there, I get the opposite. So let me put it around that way. There I've got a pair, which will go either side of a hip or a valley. So one cut does 2 sides, a male and a female if you like. The next job, once you break all the panels out, is to tape them. So we're going to cut the tapes to the length. In this case, we need 4 pieces for now, so we just simply scissor them off. All right then, put them on the deck. So Meddy's got eyesight and fingernails. But it's so satisfying when it does come off in one bit. Oh, that's great. See, what this tape is doing is turning a good insulation board into an even better insulation board. The insulation board, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's a fantastic product. You get great values out of thin widths like this. If you were doing the same in a fiberglass or a mineral wall, you'd need 2.5 times the thickness. And where you've only got a void of a certain amount to allow for airflow in a roof raft, for example. This is why this stuff came about in the first place. But by adding this tape to it, you're actually making it even better, and it's going to be doing the job it's set out to do. And even the building regulations in the future are going to insist that you evidence the fact that the building works properly. So here's a pair of angled ones to go into a hip. So you can see that they're both exactly the same. If I rock them over like that, they're all taped up and ready to go. And now again, friction fit perfectly into the valley or the hip. And so what we're doing is we're using some of our offcuts to get the shape, and then we're adding on with a square section. Where you're butting these boards together as well, one end of one of the boards have the tape, and then you get that lovely fit without any gap whatsoever. I'll try to demonstrate that here by just butting two together. It's absolutely perfect. This is a cold roof, which means that my insulation is on the warm side of the building. A warm roof is where it's on the outside of the building and you don't need a ventilated space. In my case, the insulation travels here, and then I've got an airflow gap all the way over. It's around about 90 millimeters, and that air comes from an overfascia vent at the bottom, travels all the way through and goes over the top of the ridge, all the way down and out the other side. Now it's really key that that ventilation space is clear, uninterrupted, and you get that clear airflow over. Now the trouble with a ventilated airspace is it's cold air, and that's why this tape really comes into its own, because when you friction fit and push it in there, it's completely sealed. Normally, when you try to cut a solid insulation board into rafters that can sometimes give a little bit of a twist or an undulation, you'll find that you end up with gaps, and people get the foam out and try to foam them up, or I've seen quite a lot of the time people put them in and just tack a couple of nails to stop them falling out, and they're really loose. It really affects the performance of the insulation. So my insulation is exactly where I want it, and I don't push it into my airspace. I've got a bucket of what I call reference battens or reference blocks, and this is my insulation point there. So I've just got the reference blocks, and I'm just going to pin them in. And that will stop the insulation moving. I've got them on the joins, where the joins are, and in some places I've put them where there's a very long piece of insulation. So they're at the bottom, they're on the board join here, and they're at the top. So we're ready to go for it. Push. It's an absolute joy putting it in with this tape. There's no dust whatsoever. That's the best thing for me. Pushing them back against the reference blocks, it's an absolute dream. So now we've put all of the main panels in the roof. That means all of the panels which get up to the first set of blocks, and then the cut panels that goes up against the ridge. We've put all of those in, and now we've come to this hip, and we're going to be producing panels like this, which have got a compound cut on, so they fit exactly up into the hip. And the way I did that initially was I've got a template which is exactly the shape to fit, and it fits everywhere. So we'll be measuring one side and then marking that angle on using the rail, which is set at 15 degrees in our case, and that will give us that lovely compound cut. We'll tape them up and then we'll slot them in. So that will be the last part of this install. We've done the valley in exactly the same way, and that's turned out absolutely beautifully. The valley is a bit simpler because when you press them in, you're pushing them into a parallel space. With the hip, on the other hand, you're actually pushing them in and they're longer on the top edge. So we'll have to pull those others down and wiggle them in to make sure they fit, to avoid that unnecessary gap at the back. You'll see that the angle is exactly right. I've taken my panel, I've marked my long length. I've made it so the rail is exactly on the line. On the base of the saw, there's a groove. The groove is hooking in to the back side of the rail, a side we don't generally use. It's the side that you connect the rails together with. What that's given me now, the right cut, and it's given me an opposite cut. So I've got some smaller ones which I can then take from this. So as I said earlier, you're doing the job once, but you're gaining 2 parts. So if you're interested in the Festool ISC 240 that I'm using here, check the channel soon because we've got a separate video all about it. We've just finished the install of our solid insulation board, and I just wanted to show you or talk to you a little bit about the tape and the problems that it addresses. So first of all, take this little model here. This is a well-fitted piece of insulation board, but this is what we're talking about here. It's the performance gap, and that's a really nicely fitted board. But you can see that your joists, they cup and they undulate, sometimes they bow, and the best will in the world, trying to cut them to fit exactly, it's really difficult. Now let's take a little piece of insulation board which is taped, and you'll see it's been cut slightly under 8 to 10 mil. The tape's been put on the side and you're getting a perfect friction fit. And we'll show you the same here, mineral wool. Okay, you can pack mineral wool in, but it sort of moves, shrinks back, settles and sinks, and some of the air comes through. So again, with the tape on, you get this amazing fit. It's not going to drop. You're not going to have to put the battens in to support it, just maybe some reference blocks like I've been doing here. So we cut our insulation in between. This is the warm side. This is the cold side. And what happens normally, the insulation's put in between as tight as you can get it. And then you've got your heat on this side and you've got your cold on this side. Any gaps, the cold air is coming through, it's meeting the warm air, and even if you've taped it or put a vapor control layer in here and here, it's likely to condense and cause problems. Now that's magnified as the gaps get bigger, and in testing, the Gapotape actually improved the performance of the insulation by a massive factor. That's one of the reasons why I was keen in my build to make sure I didn't have any of these issues, especially where you've got insulated slopes, because all that's going to happen is that moisture that goes in there is going to run down the slopes and meet with your wall plate at the bottom, and it's going to cause problems in the fabric of the building. Something I don't do, something I don't want. It has been a really simple install. Yes, it puts a bit of money on the cost of the job, but the hidden cost that it takes away trying to make things fit, balance nails in, push foam in between, It improves it no end. I think this is a game changer. I'm certainly going to be using it more often. Thanks for joining me on Skill Builder. Check back soon, we've got some exciting stuff coming up. I'm Robin Clevitt, see you soon.